Hello, welcome to the 365 Days of Compassion Book Club podcast. It's Chris, the host of the book club and creator of the hashtag. Each month we have a guest author whose work relates to compassion join a live book club event for an informal chat about their work. For September, we are joined by Dr Lucy Maddox, whose superb book, A Year to Change Your Mind, presents a seasonal perspective across 12 months on psychological theories and therapeutic approaches which can help in daily life. It's a great chat. Hope you enjoy it. Hello and welcome to the September 365 Days of Compassion book club. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, I'm going to start the session with a quote from today's guest author. And that quote is, and actually I will say there's a number of quotes I could have used, as there always is when I go through these books and think about things that kind of resonate. But I thought this was I thought this summed up the book actually in certain respects. So just as there is a spectrum of experience for mental health, so there is a spectrum of uses for therapy and psychological knowledge. Sometimes we might use some ideas with a light touch. Sometimes we might decide to go all in and seek professional help for a particular difficulty. Whichever, I strongly believe that these ideas are helpful and should be shared around as much as possible. Life can be tricky and it's good to have tools to help us manage. So that's from the book A Year to Change Your Mind by our guest author, Dr. Lucy Maddox. So welcome to the book club, Lucy.
Thank you so much.
So just as a quick introduction, Lucy is you describe yourself actually as a psychological magpie, don't you? I've seen it a few times, so which I love that kind of phrase. It's clinical psychologist, author, researcher. This is your third book, following on from two other books which I highly recommend: Blueprint, and a book which is perhaps aimed for young people, which is What is Mental Health? A long career really across the NHS, which you worked primarily with young people, which you talk about in the book again. A lot of great sharing of experiences from that. And outside the NHS, you're a researcher as well, currently linked into University of Bath. I think Lucy's love of learning and sharing knowledge comes across in all of her writing. In addition to the books, she's been published across various media outlets, been a lecturer, studying as well. I know you're working on a second PhD, and two masters as well. And it obviously comes across that you're learning and also wanting to share that as a kind of communicator. And also, for a number of years, Lucy was special advisor to the BABCP, within which she was the host of the very excellent Let's Talk About CBT podcast, which is where I first met Lucy, actually, doing the episode that covered compassion-focused therapy, which was a very surreal moment, being interviewed by Lucy in Professor Paul Gilbert's lounge. But that's
It was a
story
lovely
for another story for another day. Okay, so thank you very much for coming along, Lucy.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for such a kind introduction as well. That's lovely.
And it's lovely to have some folks with us as well. You will have a chance to ask some questions during on. I've got a few questions that I just want to ask Lucy to start off with, but feel free to join in. So Lucy, the book A Year to Change Your Mind. I'm always intrigued by what's the inspiration and motivation for a book. So what was it that kind of inspired this?
Yeah, I think this has been sort of brewing for a number of years, and it was really just that I was providing psychological therapy for people, but also using a lot of the ideas in my own life and thinking that they were sometimes things that I would want to share with friends and family as well. Um, and I guess just thinking about that idea of giving psychology away, really, and how it's something that can be really useful for people, I think. And we should be trying to give it away. I think we should be trying to make it as freely accessible as possible. And it feels to me like a lot of people might be interested or might benefit from some of the ideas from psychological therapy, even if they don't want to go or maybe can't go for some reason to have a full experience of therapy for one thing or another. Or they may not feel like they're meeting a threshold for going to have some individual therapy, but they might still get some benefit from some of those ideas. So it was just a deep desire to share, really, to share some of the knowledge that I thought was helpful.
And the structure of the 12 months, which so for those who not read the book, it's divided into the season, the 12 months of the year. And I really thought it was a clever idea of how you've linked seasonal elements of each of the months kind of into some of those psychological constructs and concepts. So, January in terms of new starts, or anger with the kind of summer heat and those kind of things. That was really really clever idea, actually. Was that quite hard to do, though? How did that idea kind of come around, and was it quite hard to link into the different months?
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, it came about because I was writing sort of on and off on a blog, and also on Instagram posts, and sort of trying to share ideas here and there, when something, I guess, around me at the time sort of resonated with a psychological idea. And I was spotting sort of themes coming up a little bit. So like September, for example, at this time of year, I always get that back to school feeling, and it always sort of makes me reflect a little bit about work and what I'm doing. And January, the same kind of themes of, these messages you get about new year, new you, and how you should be changing things, often makes me think, well, what's the actual evidence around making changes and sticking to them, and making decisions. So I guess these themes were sort of around for me anyway, and it felt like a nice way to hang some of these ideas on, a sort of way in almost, and maybe to encourage people, that they could either read the book as a whole or they could dip in and out of it. But yes, some of it. So some of it felt like it flowed a lot, like it was sort of easy to write. But there were a few chapters where it felt a bit clunkier to decide what should go where. So I think sort of April, May, June, they could have been in any order really, those ones. Okay. So it was more me sort of imposing the structure on them. But I really wanted to get those ideas in. Whereas some of the other ones were a bit more obvious.
Okay. And you do cover a lot in each of the chapters, and you cover various, so even if, so for example, if January starts off with change, it expands on different other theories, and you link it all together, which I found really, really fascinating. Actually, having studied psychology, there's still bits and pieces that I was learning about. You bring in so many different therapies in terms of, using different approaches out of something like ACT or DBT will be mentioned, as well as perhaps ones that aren't even as well known, like solutions focused therapy, pulling all that together. And all of that is underlined with some very relatable case studies. But was there anything that you wanted to get in that didn't get into the book? Or was there something that perhaps got left on the editing floor, as it were?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Yeah, I don't think anything got edited out. There were like editorial discussions about where different bits should go. But yeah, it didn't get edited out. I think there was one discussion about whether I'm trying to remember which bit it was, sort of a feeling of like whether we like how serious it should get, like how much the book should touch on things that were at the sort of pointier end, I guess, of human experience. But actually, we did keep most of those examples in because I feel like it's quite important. Like you can learn from, like it is a spectrum. You can learn from the more extreme experiences as well, and also just important to show that it is a spectrum, and it's a lot of these more extreme experiences could happen to any of us, and it's not something that happens to other people necessarily. But there was, I haven't got very much in it about obsessive thoughts or compulsive behaviours actually, and that was something that I did think, oh, that is a really interesting area of research, and that does apply to everyday life in different ways as well.
Mm.
There just wasn't an obvious place to put that, and by that time there was quite a lot in it already. so, so yeah, there's not much about that, but I do think that is an interesting area of research.
Mm. And that's an interesting comment you just made in terms of the editorial decision about which topic, because I do think that some books kind of shy away from, things like anxiety or depression would be talked about, but then, something like hearing voices might not be, because it's seen as that's that, and I think it's an interesting. I think I support what you kind of decision you made on that, because I think sometimes in these discussions about mental health, they kind of get pushed away. There's kind of almost acceptable mental health that's going to be talked about, and then there's that's still not quite acceptable to talk about. And I certainly, yes, I can remember reading the book and thinking about the different examples in there. But although I've not experienced those, I could relate to them. I could take something from those cases. So no, I think that was the right decision.
Oh, good.
I think.
Thanks,
I,
Chris.
I feel like I could go through each of the months, but that would probably take a book club of 3 hours or so. But there's a few, just because we kind of focus around compassion and that concept with mental well-being. I thought there's just a few months I would like to just kind of go through in a bit more detail, if that's okay, and a bit of a chat.
Sure.
So I'm going to start with the current month of September, because that actually introduced something which I'm not sure a phrase I'd heard before. You talked about, and now it talks about the consideration of compassion fatigue, which I'd heard of before, and I think that's a phrase that's kind of fairly well known, or certainly getting into the mainstream. But then you also talked about in there compassion satisfaction. I'm not sure I'd heard that phrase before, actually. So can we just talk about perhaps ways of addressing compassion fatigue, and also how we support compassion satisfaction?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it is an interesting term, isn't it? And I think, yeah, I mean, compassion fatigue, just in case people haven't heard about it, is this idea that that in caring professions in particular, but actually in any caring role, we might experience feeling fatigued from caring, from the act of caring, and it comes now under this sort of relatively new term of empathy-based stress, which includes things like secondary trauma and burnout in there as well. So a lot of research is looking at all of these things together, and trying to understand them, and how they overlap, and what we can do about them. And the idea of compassion satisfaction is about the satisfaction we get from helping somebody else, whether that's in a caring profession again, or whether it's in a personal situation. And it's really nice, I think, to be aware of both of those different ideas, particularly if you're going into a role of any kind, which is, that is my doorbell going, I think, by the way. It's okay. Yeah, I've got it. So yeah, it's really helpful to be aware of these ideas, I think, particularly if you're going into a caring role, because if you're not aware that you can start to feel fatigued in a compassionate role, then you might feel like that's something that has a bit of shame attached around it, or that you shouldn't talk about. And actually, some of the ways that you can cope with those sorts of feelings are, in fact, to talk about it, to acknowledge what's going on, to notice the times when you're feeling more compassion fatigued or more burnt out, and to try and do what you can to change those things that are happening around those times, whether that's something you do on a kind of individual level, or whether you speak to the system around and try and change things in the system that you're working with. And compassion satisfaction can be really helpful to kind of guard against compassion fatigue. So if we kind of notice those times when we are helping somebody and it's being effective and it's making us feel a sense of connection, a sense of sort of efficacy, really, in that setting, then that can be really helpful. But quite often, certainly in healthcare workplaces, the times when we might meet to talk over what has happened for somebody, it's usually when something's not gone right and when we're trying to find out what's gone wrong, what we can do better next time. And that is really, really, really important. But it's also a shame that there's not a bit more discussion about, oh, look, actually things have gone really well for this person. What did we do well? What can we make sure we do again? Can we just take a minute to appreciate that actually we spent some time doing this and that was a good thing. So partly just being aware of the terms, I think, can be helpful, and trying to focus a bit on the moments of compassion, satisfaction. But there's also quite a large body of research looking at things that we can do on an individual level. So things like watching out for how we know that we're feeling stress and fatigue, and thinking about how we manage the demands on us. So sort of trying to reduce the amount of stress coming into our stress bucket is how I tend to teach about this. And thinking about how we can punch holes in that stress bucket to let the stress out, and making sure that we're not accidentally funneling stress back in by doing something which feels like it's helpful in the short term, but actually makes you feel worse in the medium to long term. So, things like having a nice glass of wine to relax after a hard day turns into a bottle of wine, then you're hungover the next day. You can't cope as well with the emotional demands upon you, that kind of thing. So some of it's at an individual level, but then there's also some stuff on a kind of more thinking more about the community of people around you. So things like wondering about in a team, if you're working in a healthcare team, how you share information about traumatic experiences which have happened to the people that you're working with, how much you share details of that, partly from a patient confidentiality point of view, but also from a systems point of view. If there's a lot of highly traumatic information being talked about without warning, it can lead people to feel like they're constantly kind of under threat, really, or constantly trying to deal with this very difficult information. And making really clear, intentional spaces to do that work, to talk about that in a way that's going to be helpful both for the healthcare professional and for the patient. And then on an even bigger sort of systems level, thinking about what are the demands that are being placed on somebody in that situation. Are they unreasonable? What resources have they got? Have they got access to good supervision, good training? Are they taking enough holiday? Really, it sounds really basic, but actually they're the sorts of things that in a stressed workplace, when people have started taking a lot of time off and other people are trying to cover for them, those sorts of things can go, and they're really, really crucial actually to helping people to be able to do a job like that. And if it's in a more sort of personal setting, because lots of these ideas apply to healthcare professionals, but or social work professionals or other helping professionals, but also in a personal capacity. If you're caring for somebody in whatever capacity that is, just thinking about, are you trying to do that 24/7, or are there points where you're able to have a break? Are there resources that you can tap into to mean that the demands are not all the time? Because that's just really unrealistic, actually, often, to expect that somebody can do that without then feeling very frustrated or depleted and like their capacity for care is compromised. I could wang on about this for ages. So
That's brilliant. No, there's so much in there. Actually, I was thinking about the fact that we don't do the reflection. It struck me when you talked about the fact that people do focus on when something goes wrong, but we don't tend to focus on having time to celebrate stuff, which is kind of that whole thing, isn't it? About on an individual basis, if you go shopping in 10 shops, you have 9 great experiences. You have 1 bad experience. The only one you ever talk about is the bad experience. We kind of focus on that. But it is a challenge, isn't it, in very fast-paced or stressed environments to actually almost be courageous to take the time to reflect on that actually and step back. And as you say, some of those basic things can go out the window when it's stressful, which is totally the opposite of what needs to happen.
Yeah, I think the basics are really hard to hang on to. And they're the sorts of things that we advise other people to do often, but they're really hard to do for ourselves when we're up against it.
Mm. So that kind of flows very nicely actually to the month of November in the book, because that has a focus around, or it considers the role of rest and self-care, um, with a little bit of CFT, emotional regulation model, thrown in there around the three systems. For those who are not aware of that, there's the drive threat and then the soothing system. Is the kind of emotional model concept. Um, and you use a really, what I thought was a very interesting case study there of Jack. Could we just go through it? The reason I found that interesting was that on the face of it, there are certain things that in that case study he does where you kind of think, well, that is rest, but actually it's not. And I think you kind of hint a little bit about the stress booking and stuff. But can we just expand on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. Jack's very close to my heart actually. It's all of the case studies are they're amalgamations of different problems that people have come to me with. And some of them are also mixed in with things that I recognise from my life. And Jack certainly is I can recognise some of his behaviours for sure. So the case study is he's a trainee psychiatrist, and he's somebody who is filling up his time a lot. So he's very he's doing very high powered job and a very demanding job, and he's also got a lot of kind of socializing mapped in. Goes dating, goes to see friends, is involved in a football team. He's got lots going on for him, and that's all really positive. But he's not feeling as good as he would like to. And thinking about it from those three models that you just talked about. So the idea that there are these three systems involved. So the drive system, where we're doing things that we're highly motivated to do and feeling a sense of reward from doing those. The threat system, where we're feeling under threat and under pressure. So like there's something sort of threatening, not necessarily in terms of sort of threatening to your life, but threatening to your sense of self, or to your causing you stress in some way. And then the soothe system, where we can activate our parasympathetic nervous system and feel like we are able to properly stop and rest. And everything that Jack was doing, when we sort of look at it, it falls into either the drive system or the threat system. So there wasn't anything really that was helping him to activate his parasympathetic nervous system. And part of the work with him was thinking about how to build in some space in between everything that he had mapped out for him, where he could feel a sense of rest and relaxation. And it was really difficult. And I think it can feel difficult if you're somebody who's used to being on a lot and doing a lot, and feeling a real sense of achievement because you're managing to do a lot, and also feeling like lots of those things are fun, and that's good to kind of put lots in your diary and make sure you're making the most out of everything. Then taking a bit of time to just have a little bit more space, or a bit of time to sit still, can feel quite challenging. And in the case example, we talk about how Jack felt like when there was a bit more space, actually other thoughts were coming in and other feelings were coming in, and he felt sort of sadder for a while, because he was noticing that actually he felt quite lonely in some ways, and that wasn't something he had to think about or feel so much if he was constantly on the go. But being able to notice that meant that he could also think about what he wanted to do about that, and how to seek out senses of connection in other ways. Um, but yeah, really interesting thing to think about, I think, how we spend our time and whether there is um, a bit of wiggle room in there, because it's so easy. I mean, I did it myself the other day, actually. I looked at my diary and I had back-to-back meetings all day. And by the end of the day, I felt so frazzled. And it reminded me a bit of pandemic times when everybody was doing everything on Zoom,
Mhm.
continuously. That feeling, really, your head just feeling really frazzled at the end. And I was thinking, this is ridiculous. Why have I got back to the meetings in? The only person who's putting those meetings in is actually me. So it's not like I can take this to anyone to complain about. But it's quite easy just to forget that you can put in a bit of space. And
Mhm.
actually, that's really, really important.
That's really, thank you for going through that, because I thought the Jack case study was really interesting, because I think there's a lot of talk about self-care and rest in the media, etc. But I think what you did with that case study was to illustrate that yes, he might be sat down, or going to do sport. That sounds like, but if it's adding, or it's increasing, maybe it's a stress-related thing or it's a driven thing. Um, that's not healthy. It's trying to keep those kind of systems in balance. And that's not to say that drive isn't a. We all need some level of drive. It's not getting into that over excessive level. So I thought it was a really good, really, really, really interesting case study. So thank you for talking through that a little bit more. Um, the other months that I'd like to kind of look at was April, and the reason for this one is that this talks about the concept of the inner critic, or that critical voice that we all have. And again, obviously, this has got quite a link into the concept of compassion as well. And you also bring in the role of narrative, the stories that we're telling. Um, could you perhaps talk through some of the ideas of how to help with that very harsh, often very harsh voice that we have?
It's so tricky, isn't it? Because we spend all of our time with ourselves. So, if you've got a voice inside your head which is, not being helpful or being actually unhelpful, then it has a really powerful impact on how you feel. It's like hanging out with a friend who's not very nice, like all the time. So I really think it's worth spending time with this one, because I think small changes in it can make quite a big difference, actually, just because we're with it all the time. Um, so in April's chapter, I was thinking, just as you said, about this idea that we can be our own harshest critic, really,
Mm.
and that kind of monologue we might have on a difficult day if things are going wrong, and um, just if you kind of hold that up to the light a bit and think about what you're saying to yourself, sometimes it can feel quite shocking, actually. Things that you wouldn't say to anybody else, you wouldn't say necessarily to a good friend or even to somebody you didn't like very much. You wouldn't sit there saying, oh, how silly you've done that, how ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. And Mary Welford does some lovely examples of this in her training, where she really berates herself for forgetting her keys,
Mm.
um, in a really harsh tone of voice as well, because often the tone of voice is really important too. Um, and I think there's lots of ideas from different sorts of therapy models about this. So uh, from cognitive behavioural therapy, thinking about looking at what you're saying to yourself and actually looking at the evidence for and against those statements to think, is that actually true, and is there any alternative explanation? In fact, is it that you're really stupid for forgetting your keys, or is it that you're actually really tired and juggling a lot of things? So thinking about that, and what would you say to a good friend, is a question that I think is
Mm.
often really, really helpful, just to move you to a different perspective. Um, but also ideas, as you said, from narrative therapy. So thinking about, the stories that we tell about ourselves, we can connect the same events in lots of different ways. So um, we can kind of pick and choose the things that have happened to us and make a story out of them, and we might get to quite a different place. So example I always sort of come back to is about my driving. So if I think about my driving from a kind of anxious state of mind, anxious point of view, I might think about how um, I learned to drive in London and then didn't drive for a long time and actually feel quite anxious. I might think about the near miss I think I had pulling out of a junction the other day, or I might think about how I clipped the wing mirror. I might think about those sorts of things.
Mm.
Whereas if I'm coming at it from a more generous perspective to myself, I might think, well, I haven't practiced for that long, and actually I have been going out and making sure that I practice, and I have driven at least once a week for so many weeks. And, I might create a different story there about how actually I'm feeling quite brave in trying to combat that anxiety. So we can tell a story different ways and pick and choose those different events a little bit, and they create almost like thinking about creating different constellations from the same points in our stories or in our lives. And another thing that comes from narrative therapy is the idea of externalizing that voice.
Mm.
And I also really like this. So thinking about, if you were going to externalize your voice and turn it into a character, what would it look like? What would it smell like? What would it be doing? What would it say? And for me, I always sort of feel like my really critical inner voice is a bit of a kind of tall, thin, grey man wearing a grey suit, and sort of quite drawn
Yeah.
out and bony and critical, but trying to also perhaps see that critical voice is probably just trying to keep us safe. It's probably coming from experiences that we've had in the past, or things that people have said to us in the past, where we feel like that's a helpful way of coping with with what we're trying to do. But actually, perhaps those things have outlived their usefulness, and that's no longer helpful anymore. But being able to say to this external character, "Oh, thank you for your advice, but I think I'm okay. Actually, I think I'm doing all right," can be quite a useful technique as well. So yeah, I think there's quite a lot of different techniques to draw on, and I think it's a thing which is really helpful to practice. And we have lots of opportunity to practice because we're there with our head all the time. So
Yeah.
it's not something I think that you get sorted and then it's all fine. But I think if your general tone of voice can get kinder, and then if you can notice those times when you're maybe feeling a bit depleted and it's got a bit nastier, and kind of nip that in the bud, then I think that can be really, really helpful.
Oh, that's brilliant. No, that's a really excellent kind of summary of different things. I think it is practicing it. It can be one of those things that also kind of goes out the window during a stressful time, etc. So, and it's finding, I think, what works for you as an individual, which of those kind of techniques you can kind of rely on.
Yeah, sure. Nothing works for everyone, I think. So
No,
yeah.
just kind of following on from the kind of inner critical bit, I guess writing a book must expose yourself to, to kind of your inner critic a bit, I guess. And obviously the books also, which is brilliant. You've abridged a version of it on BBC Sound, so there's 12 episode series, which is excellent because you've done a brilliant job actually of condensing into 15 minutes the parts of the chapters. How did you find doing that recording? Does that also bring in that kind of inner critic as well?
Well, that's such a great question. Yeah, I can't take credit for the abridgment. That was done. That was done by somebody else.
Okay.
So, but and because I think I would have found that really hard. Actually, it's really hard to. They call it like killing your darlings, don't they, with editing?
Yeah.
Really hard to take your own words out. But yeah, I've had three experiences of recording a sort of big chunk of my own writing like that. So I did the audiobook for Blueprint, and I did the audiobook for A Year to Change Your Mind, and then I did the BBC Sounds record,
Okay.
which was separate. They wanted a different recording because they'd taken out it wouldn't have flowed if they'd just taken out the audio.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And the first time I did it with Blueprint, I found it excruciating. And I just remember sitting, it was a very, very hot week, and the recorder was in London, and it was in this tiny little booth. And I just remember sitting there sort of sweating and trying to read this out loud. There weren't any windows in the room, so I couldn't really see anyone. I just had this voice in my ear when I made a mistake. So they would just, oh no, pick up from. So, and that I had to really try and dissociate from the content, because I just had this sort of inner critical monologue going, that's a bit repetitive, or why have you written it like that? that was not easy. But this time around, I actually found it more enjoyable.
Okay.
And I don't know why that was. Maybe I was not expecting the same thing. I don't know. Maybe it's expectation. Also, it was in a bigger studio, so I could there was a window, I could see the audio person. Maybe that helped. But there were, yeah, a few times when I felt like, oh yeah, that's a bit repetitive, but it didn't feel so personal. It didn't feel like, it felt like, yeah, like a criticism about the text rather than about me, I think. And then by the time it got to the BBC audio version, I was just so pleased to have it on BBC Sounds, because that's just incredibly lucky. It just comes about because your publisher sends the book out to BBC Sounds and sees if they consider it. And someone called Karen liked it, pitched it, and it got picked up. So it was just really, really lucky, and I felt really grateful. And I had a lovely producer called Allegra who was very encouraging as well, and the sound guy Mike was lovely too. And it was sort of felt quite shiny to me to go to the BBC and record it. So yeah, I was just really excited and enjoyed it really. Yeah, I think with that there were a few, the bits of like having to record stuff because your voice goes a little bit and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't feel as tricky.
It comes across really well, and the person who did do the abridging, is that the word, abridging? That, yeah, they did a really good job, because it does really capture the essence of the book. But I can appreciate from an author's point of view that would have been very difficult
Yeah, I wouldn't have been
to
able to
do.
do it, but no, I agree. She did a really good job. Yeah, she did.
So, Lisa, aside from being an author, and now your mum as well, but you're also doing research. Um, so being a bit of a research geek, what are you currently working on in terms of your research? And is there any areas of research that you're hearing about that sound really exciting to you?
Oh, yeah, there's lots actually. Yeah, so what I'm working on is a project. I was lucky enough to get some NIHR funding to do a project trying to make an intervention for people who work in mental health wards for teenagers, which is a setting that I used to work in a lot.
Mm.
And trying to help staff with empathy-based stress, basically, and compassion fatigue and burnout, with a view to then that being helpful to the patient's care. So hoping that the young people on those wards then experience more compassionate care. And so I've just done a systematic literature review of interventions in mental health wards, and I'm about to do a big series of focus groups to co-produce the intervention. So actually, if anyone's listening to this and they are somebody who worked in a mental health ward, or has been a young person on a mental health ward, or a parent or carer of a young person on a mental health ward, I'd be really interested to hear from them, and they can just email me at lucy@lucymaddox.co.uk, because we'll be doing these focus groups soon. So that's quite exciting. And in terms of the research that I've sort of been following recently, a lot of it's about how to make interventions in a way that is using co-production and really thinking about the system that the intervention is going to happen in. So there's this thing called intervention mapping that I've been reading a lot about, which is a 6-stage process, really trying to make sure that the system is thought about, the system around the person, and also that the people who are going to receive the intervention are involved in making the intervention. So that's been really interesting to me. But also been following sort of some of my colleagues' research. So at the University of Bath, there's some really nice research going on to do with climate change and psychology. In fact, it might kind of link with some of your interests in Derby. So there's a couple of researchers, Lorraine Whitmarsh and Elizabeth Marks, have both been looking at how we respond psychologically to climate change and how we can help people to be able to think about it and to be able to make changes. So I guess I'm just really impressed by that research because it's feels very relevant and very wide reaching.
I'm a bit of a fan of Lorraine Whitmarsh actually, and the cast work that they do around Centre for Sustainability and Transport, because I think what they do is to try and highlight some of the I won't say facts, but some of this, there's a lot of, particularly at the moment, around things like ULEZ and etc. There's a lot of talk in the media, but I quite like the fact they go behind that and try and show actually what people's opinions actually are, as opposed to the kind of media outlets. So yeah, no, they do some really good work.
Yeah, nice. That's nice that you've heard about them too. Yeah, yeah. I think I definitely admire their work, and I think there's also there's been some interesting work on young people's mental health recently, particularly post-pandemic, kind of thinking about how young people's mental health is and whether it's changed over the course of time. And some of that's a bit troubling, really, because it does seem like perhaps young people's mental health is not as good as it was before. And I guess I find that helpful though, because then it perhaps makes us think about why is that and what can we be doing differently.
Yeah. Yes, it's an interesting piece around that. And again, there's the media views around that, and then there's the actual the evidence. And unfortunately for that as well, some of the evidence takes time to come through for us to actually make the right decision. And I really like the fact that you talked earlier about the co-production piece in terms of interventions, because I think often historically interventions have tend to been developed without that kind of level of involvement, kind of being tested on people, but not they're not having their voice heard. So that's really interesting. That's really great. I'm gonna pause because we're coming up towards the end. I don't know if there's any questions from any of the attendees, if they'd like to ask Lucy anything, or follow on from any of the comments that have come out during the chat.
I haven't really got any questions because Chris asks such good questions that there's never anything to ask when he's finished. But I was just interested there thinking about the interventions. I work quite a lot with people with eating disorders, and that would be really nice to think about interventions with those people and developing things with them, because I think so much is done to them, and sometimes it's almost unavoidable because some of them are at real physical risk, but I'm always striving to really try and work alongside them and help them make good choices. But I haven't really looked at any of that work on how interventions are developed. So that would be quite interesting just from that perspective, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like really important work that you're doing. I think it is it's an incredibly difficult thing, isn't it? There's so much, both the sort of physical and psychological aspects, aren't there, with eating disorders, and the anxiety in the system is so intense, understandably, that absolutely it can feel like there's a lot being done to rather than done with.
Yeah, and given that so much of, or so many of the things that they're often doing are about control, and so it feels if we're not giving them control to help to think about their own well-being, it just fuels the fire that's already burning, I think. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks for that. Thank you. If there are no other questions, I'm going to say thank you so much, Lucy, because it's been brilliant. I could go on. We could have gone through the whole book. I'm going to keep recommending it to folks, and I recommended you other books as well. Blueprint was, I think I read that just before I did my psychology degree, and there were bits in it that suddenly kind of resonated, especially when somebody mentioned the what was it, the locus of control? Because
yeah,
yeah,
did it make you think of a locust?
I started laughing, and quite a few people in the lecture were like, "Why is he laughing at that?" But anyway, there we go. And if you want to know why I was laughing, you need to get Blueprint and have a read of it. So Lucy, thank you so much. It's been really delightful.
Thanks so much for having me. It's
Thanks
been
for sharing.
lovely to speak with you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for everyone who's come along as well. I'm just going to end on a last quote, because I think this taps into quite a bit that you talked about around the inner critic. And you wrote, "We have more control over our inner narratives than we think we do. Coaxing yours even into a 1% more nourishing voice than it is now is meaningful. It's worth spending some time with this. The rewards can be big." And I think you shared some ways of doing that earlier, and I think that's a really key message, perhaps to conclude the book club on. So thank you once again.
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much, Chris.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris, for organising. Thank you, Lucy, for writing a wonderful book.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure.
So that was the September book club. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. It really was an insightful, informative chat with Lucy, which could have gone on much longer, and we could have covered more of the months from the book. I'd like to thank Lucy again for being such a great guest and coming along to share her insight. Thanks also to Sue for helping with the organisation, and for everyone who came along to the event. Look out for details of the next book club, which will be shared soon on social media under the 365 Days of Compassion hashtag. So until next time, thanks for listening. Bye.